Fort Dunlop survived the First World War, survived the Depression, survived the Second, survived the decades when Britain's industrial confidence was slowly, quietly dismantled. It didn't survive the spreadsheet. Walk through the fort today and the building is intact. 7 floors of commercial space, a hotel extension, managed suites that promise good parking and excellent connectivity. The central stores building that once held the output of a rubber empire now holds marketing agencies. Where the proving ground once stretched, where engineers tested tyres to the edge of destruction on surfaces of polished pebble and granite, there is a retail park. You can buy things there. You simply cannot make them. 10,000 workers, 100 years of tyre making. Ended, finally, in May 2014, when the last plant closed and production moved to Germany and France. How does a place that survived everything lose, in the end, to decisions made in rooms it never saw? That's the question Fort Dunlop has been asking ever since. This is the answer, or as close to one as the evidence allows. There's a building beside the M6 that you've almost certainly seen without really looking at it. Most people don't. It's become part of the furniture of that motorway, filed away in the brain as background, like cooling towers or overpasses, things that have always been there and presumably always will be. You clock it at 70 miles an hour, maybe a little more if the traffic's moving, and what registers is this? Something enormous. Something red brick and long and deliberate, with the proportions of a thing that was built to be seen from a distance. Something that, even now in the second decade of the 21st century, still reads from the road as a declaration. The sign says, Fort Dunlop. Below it, the building offers what its owners describe as a vertical office park. 360,000 square feet across 7 floors, managed suites. Meeting rooms, a hotel in the modern extension, clean lines, contemporary furniture, the kind of place that serves flat whites and has excellent Wi-Fi. Marketing agencies, consultancies, the kinds of businesses that run on laptops and calls, and the occasional client breakfast. This is what Fort Dunlop is now. It is worth spending a moment, just a moment, with what Fort Dunlop was. By 1954, the factory area employed 10,000 workers, 10,000 people who arrived every day in their thousands through the gatehouses of a site so large it had its own internal roads, its own canteen fleet, its own laundry, its own laboratories, its own small civilization nested inside the larger one. They came to turn raw rubber, shipped from the plantations of Malaya, from a supply chain that stretched across the breadth of the British Empire, into the tyres that kept Britain moving. The tyres that went on lorries and buses and family saloons. The tyres that went onto racing cars at Le Mans, at circuits across Europe, hand-built in a facility on this very site, cured under enormous heat and pressure, finished by people whose hands knew their craft the way a musician's hands know an instrument. 10,000 people. One working world. Today, the office park has parking. Good parking, they'll tell you. One of the amenities worth mentioning in the prospectus. And a little further along Fort Parkway, where the proving ground once stretched out across open land, the banked sections, the skid pads, the surfaces laid specifically to test tyres to the edge of failure, there is a shopping park. Retail, restaurants, the ordinary commerce of the early 21st century. To understand how a place like this becomes what it is now, you have to go back to when it was something else entirely. To when the name above the gate meant something that had nothing to do with meeting rooms and everything to do with what this country was capable of making. You have to go back to the beginning. The story, as so many British industrial stories do, begins with something small. In 1888, a Scottish-born veterinary surgeon living in Belfast fitted an air-filled tube to the wheels of his son's tricycle. The boy had been complaining. The solid rubber wheels judded over Belfast's cobbled streets, and the rides were uncomfortable. John Boyd Dunlop was a practical man. He found a practical solution. He wrapped the wheels in rubber, inflated it, and sent his son out to try them. The difference was immediate. The cushion of air absorbed the road. The ride was transformed. Dunlop wasn't the first person to have thought of the idea. A Scottish engineer named Robert William Thompson had patented something similar more than 40 years earlier in 1845, though it never caught on. Dunlop didn't know about Thompson's patent when he made his experiment in a Belfast yard in 1888. He was simply a man with a child, a bicycle, and the particular kind of stubbornness that turns a small domestic observation into something that changes the world. He took out a patent. He wrote to a cycle company. And then, quite quickly, the thing escaped his hands entirely. The man who understood what Dunlop had actually invented, understood it commercially, strategically, in the way that turns an idea into an empire, was Harvey Ducross, a Dublin businessman with a sharp eye for opportunity and the energy to pursue it. Ducross saw that the pneumatic tyre wasn't a bicycle accessory. It was the future of wheeled transport. In November 1889, the Pneumatic Tyre and Booth Cycle Agency was established, beginning the process of turning Dunlop's workshop experiment into a global commercial enterprise. John Boyd Dunlop himself would not be part of it for long. The Science Museum records note he was involved only in the early stages. The invention outlasted the inventor's involvement by more than a century. It happens that way sometimes. A man solves a problem for his son, and the solution runs so far ahead of him that he can only watch it go. But the name stayed, and the name mattered. By the early years of the 20th century, Dunlop had become firmly settled in Britain, in Birmingham specifically, in the Midlands that were already dense with manufacturing, already layered with the infrastructure of the First Industrial Revolution and the ambitions of the Second. Company records show Dunlop Rubber Company Limited, established in 1901. The city was already used to making things at scale. It already understood what it meant to have works that employed thousands, that drew workers from the surrounding streets, that shaped the rhythms of entire neighbourhoods. Birmingham was ready for Dunlop, and Dunlop was ready for Birmingham. But it was the war that built the fort. In 1914, Britain went to war, and the war needed tyres. It needed them in quantities that no existing facility could produce. It needed them for lorries carrying ammunition and provisions through Belgian mud, for staff cars ferrying officers between command posts, for motorcycles threading messages through lines that field telephone cables hadn't reached yet. Rubber, that strange, elastic, near-miraculous material, had become as essential to modern warfare as steel or coal. The Western Front ran, in part, on tyres. Dunlop looked at the demand and decided to build something equal to it. What rose between 1915 and 1917 on a site in Erdington, at the northern edge of Birmingham, was not simply a factory. It was a statement of industrial intent. Multiple sources, including a Times archive piece from 1925, cite 1915 as the year construction began. A 1957 motorsport account written from a visit to the site describes it as built during the middle of the First World War. However you date it precisely, the intent was the same: to create a facility large enough to meet wartime need, and beyond that, to anchor British tyre production in a single, dominant site. They named it Fort Dunlop. The name was apt. Standing at the junction of what would become the M6 corridor, the central building alone presented an elevation to the road that was effectively a wall. A long, red brick face, stories high, with a tower carrying the company name. It had the proportions of something built to last generations and to be seen from a distance. The architects, Sidney Stott and W.W. Gibbings, designed the central stores and offices building in the 1920s with a floor plate so deep, nearly 52 metres, that natural light barely reached the middle. It was built for the logic of industry, not for comfort. A machine for storing and distributing in conditions that made sense only once you understood the scale of what was happening around it. Because the central building, the one that still stands beside the motorway, was only part of it. The wider site comprised multiple specialised factories and facilities, each one dedicated to different stages of the process of turning raw rubber into finished tyres. There were production buildings, stores, workshops, canteen facilities. There were rail connections and sidings, because a works operating at this scale didn't simply receive materials by lorry. It had its own interface with the national rail network. The River Tame ran at the edge of the site, a boundary between the industrial complex and the surrounding landscape. Internal roads connected the different parts of the fort. Gatehouses controlled the movement of people and materials in and out. To stand at those gates in the 1920s or the 1930s or the 1950s was to understand that you were entering something closer to a town than a factory, and the raw material that fed it came from the other end of the world. Malaya, between the wars, provided roughly half the world's supply of natural rubber. The plantations that produced it were dominated by British-owned estates, companies that held enormous acreages in tropical conditions specifically suited to the rubber tree's cultivation. Dunlop understood early that if you depended on raw rubber, you needed to control its supply. By 1926, Dunlop held the largest rubber plantation acreage under single ownership anywhere in the British Empire, a staggering geographical reach from a Midlands factory site. The rubber came by ship to British ports. It arrived at the fort as bales of raw natural material with a particular smell, earthy, faintly sweet, nothing like the finished product, and left it weeks later as tyres. The transformation was the work of thousands of hands and processes and machines operating simultaneously on a site that never, at its height, fully stopped. Birmingham had its 1,000 trades. Fort Dunlop was one of the largest of them, and it was built to grow. Imagine arriving for the morning shift in 1968. You've walked from the terraced streets of Erdington, or cycled, or come in on the bus. A bus running on Dunlop tyres, naturally, though that thought probably doesn't occur to you. You're past the gatehouse onto the internal roads of a site so large that the far buildings are a walk away. Ahead of you, the day shift is forming. Thousands of people moving through the same gates, the same rhythms, the same particular choreography of a works that has been doing this for 50 years and knows the steps exactly. The first thing you notice every morning is the smell. Carbon black, the fine sooty material blended into rubber compounds to give them strength, gets into everything. It gets under the fingernails, into the fabric of work clothing, into the air of every building where mixing happens. Former workers describe it as filthy in a specific way, not the generalised grime of industry, but this particular substance that settles on every surface and requires, at the end of a shift, a proper shower to shift. Dunlop provided the showers. They understood the nature of their own process, and underneath the carbon black, the rubber itself. Natural rubber has a smell that's earthy, almost organic. Synthetic rubber smells different, sharper, more chemical. Then there are the solvents used in adhesive processes, described by those who worked with them as smelling like petrol. Not unpleasant exactly, but specific. The kind of smell that, 30 years later, you can recall in complete detail because it was the smell of your working life. John Warwood started at Fort Dunlop in 1968. He would later recall a site that employed, by his reckoning, around 10,000 people, a figure consistent with what the documentary record shows for the mid-1950s. His account of the fort is one of the richest we have. A former worker walking back through a place he knew in the way you know a landscape you've spent decades inside. The mill, the rubber mixing department, was the noisiest, dirtiest, most physically intense part of the operation. Huge mixing mills processed rubber compounds into the precise formulations required for different tyre types. Trapped air in the rubber released with a sound Warwood described as snap, crackle and pop. Not whimsical, but viscerally precise. You could hear it over the other machinery, over the hiss of compressed air lines, which always leaked a little, that being the nature of compressed air systems, and over the underlying mechanical rhythm of the site's endless production. In the tyre building departments, the work required a skill that was almost balletic. A 1957 motorsport journalist visiting the fort described watching tyre builders at work and struggling to capture what he was seeing in plain language. Warwood, decades later, independently reached for the same word. Like ballet dancers. The movements were precise, repetitive, trained into the body over months of practice until they became unconscious. The kind of physical intelligence that industrial work develops, and that is almost impossible to appreciate from the outside. The buildings ran on shift patterns. At peak, the fort operated 3 shifts. The same buildings, the same machines, populated by different sets of people at 6-hourly intervals, around the clock, 7 days a week. This wasn't occasional. This wasn't emergency production. This was the steady, perpetual rhythm of a works that had industrial demand to meet, and the capacity to meet it, provided it never really stopped. Feeding this rhythm was a logistics operation that deserves a moment's attention. Woerwood describes a fleet of repurposed vans carrying food trolleys to the production departments, particularly important given the sprawling geography of the site, where walking to a central canteen and back would eat too deeply into break time. Women managed much of this catering infrastructure, a fleet of workers pushing trolleys through the fort's internal roads, navigating a site so large that the vans were necessary for its more distant corners. The canteen itself was a substantial operation, a full-scale catering facility that served thousands of workers across the shift patterns, with the kind of institutional cooking that, for all its plainness, represented something. A hot meal provided by your employer in the middle of your working day. On site, there was a laundry for work clothing. There were instrument repair facilities, typewriter repair services, laboratories. There were internal transport systems for moving raw materials and finished goods between the various departments and buildings. The fort was not a factory that needed the town around it for these things. It had arranged to provide them for itself. This is what self-contained actually meant at industrial scale. For workers from the surrounding streets, Fort Dunlop represented something that went beyond employment. It represented a particular kind of security. The security of a work so embedded, so necessary, so vast, that it was difficult to imagine a world in which it wasn't there. Many families had multiple members on the payroll: wives, children, siblings, cousins. Woerwood describes the experience of being an outsider to these networks, someone without the family connections that many workers had grown up taking for granted. There was a social fabric to the fort that was woven through the surrounding community in ways that don't translate cleanly into statistics. You didn't just have a job here, your family was here, your neighbours were here, your entire social world could be, if you let it, contained within the fort's gates and the streets surrounding them. And the hierarchy was as British as the building itself: staff and shop floor, suits and overalls. The social geography of a large British works in the 1960s was not subtle. You could read it in the dining arrangements, in who used which entrance, in the different physical spaces assigned to different grades of employment. Multiple trade unions represented different categories of workers, with their own shop stewards and their own particular relationships with management. The complexity of that union landscape was not a simple story. It was a web of competing interests, solidarities, and occasional tensions that reflected the genuine complexity of a workforce of 10,000 people doing dozens of different kinds of work. But within the shop floor itself, the camaraderie was real and specific. People who spend 8-hour shifts together in loud, physically demanding conditions develop relationships that are forged by proximity and shared effort in a particular way. The language of the floor. The unwritten codes of who can take a joke and who can't, who's the character of the department, who you'd want next to you when something goes wrong. Fort Dunlop had all of this, multiplied across its dozens of departments in the particular variant specific to the Midlands. Brummy vowels and Birmingham humour, and the easy solidarity of people doing hard work together. Women at the fort in the late 1960s were concentrated largely in administrative roles, the typing pools that processed the enormous volume of paperwork required to run a site of this complexity, and in catering and domestic services. Woerwood recalls this as the norm of the era, while also noting that older workers described a different wartime fort, where women had moved into more varied production roles. The fort's workforce, like British industry generally, reflected the gendered assumptions of its time, and those assumptions would shift, slowly, unevenly, as the decades passed. Fort Dunlop was not only a place of production, it was a place of serious engineering. In 1957, a journalist from Motorsport magazine visited the site and wrote about what he found there. He described a vast rubber empire, But what struck him wasn't the scale of the factory. It was the proving ground. The commitment to testing that went beyond what production required into what confidence demanded. The Dunlop Proving Ground was a facility built specifically to understand what tyres actually did under real conditions. There was an 800-foot banked section with a transverse bank of 1 in 5, a slope that generated constant lateral force, simulating cornering loads without the variability of a real road. There was a skid pad, 400 feet by 150, approached by a 1,300-foot run-up road, where tyres were assessed under controlled braking and cornering conditions. There were surfaces of different materials, smooth asphalt, granite sets, sea-polished pebbles. Different surfaces failed tyres in different ways and for different reasons, and a company that claimed to understand the physics of grip needed to test on all of them. High-speed test rigs operated inside specialised test houses, where instrumentation measured forces and deformations and temperatures in conditions that could be repeated exactly. Because what you couldn't repeat, you couldn't measure. The visitors could watch through observation windows as tyres were pushed beyond ordinary use into the conditions of failure, because understanding failure was the only reliable way to engineer safety. This matters because it reframes the fort's identity. Fort Dunlop wasn't a place that simply produced large quantities of product. It was a place with genuine engineering ambition, a belief that quality was something you tested into existence through method and rigour not assumed. The proving ground wasn't a marketing exercise. It was the infrastructure of confidence. A tyre that came off the fort's production line had been built according to compounds and constructions that had been tested to destruction on this very site. The men on the proving ground weren't performing, they were doing science, and the most demanding application of that science was motorsport. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, Dunlop was among the major suppliers of tyres to Formula One. The cars that competed at the highest level of motor racing were, in part, products of Fort Dunlop's engineering knowledge, of the understanding of rubber compounds, casing structures, and performance characteristics that had been accumulated on the proving ground and in the test houses. Racing records of the era reflect Dunlop's prominence in the sport. Tyre supplier statistics from the period confirm it as a significant presence across the major teams. Within the wider Fort Dunlop complex, a dedicated motorsport facility produced the specialist tyres that went on to racing cars. A 2013 account of this facility, written while it was still operational, describes a 24-hour production schedule, which should surprise no one who understands what motorsport demands. The construction process for a high-performance racing tyre involves stages that are genuinely remarkable. Banbury mixers blending rubber compounds to precise specifications. Layers of different materials, rubber, fabric, steel, assembled by hand in specific sequence. Then vulcanization. The application of heat and pressure somewhere around 200 degrees Celsius and 10 bar for roughly 20 minutes, during which the raw rubber chemically transforms into the material that can survive a Formula One car's demands at racing speed. Heat, pressure, time, chemistry. Standing in the vulcanization area was an experience of industrial intensity. The machines that contained this process were not gentle. The smell of rubber curing under heat is distinct. Dense, chemical, impossible to mistake for anything else. And this was continuous, across every shift, in a room that stayed warm in ways a British winter couldn't entirely overcome. The men who built those tyres, and it was, in this facility, primarily men, were doing something that required both physical skill and a trained eye for quality that couldn't entirely be reduced to procedure. A tyre bound for a racing car carried real stakes. The driver who relied on it was trusting that the hands which built it had done their job correctly. The workers in that department understood this. It was part of what made the work matter. By the late 1950s, Fort Dunlop stood at the height of its powers. 10,000 workers, a proving ground that exemplified engineering seriousness. Motorsport contracts that put the fort's product in front of the largest audiences in world motor racing. Supply chains that stretched to the Malayan Peninsula and drew from the accumulated rubber knowledge of decades. The word empire that motorsports journalists used in 1957 was not, for once, a journalist's exaggeration. 1954 is as good a year as any to mark the peak. By that point, the factory area employed 10,000 workers, a figure recorded in the documentary history of the site, and consistent with the recollections of those who worked there in the following decade. The fort had been producing tyres through 2 world wars. It had survived the Depression and the rationing of the post-war years. It had grown with Britain's motorisation, with the spread of the car from middle-class luxury to working-class possibility that defined the 1950s. It was feeding a market that seemed to have no ceiling. British car production in the 1950s was growing at a pace that felt, at the time, like the establishment of a permanent new order. The roads were filling up, the motor industry was expanding, and every car needed 4 tyres, and every set of tyres wore out, and every owner who replaced them reached for the brand that had been on their car when it left the factory, or the brand whose name they knew. Dunlop was one of those names. The fort's self-image was of a company that had earned its position through genuine quality, through the proving ground and the test houses, through the engineering knowledge that had accumulated over 50 years of making tyres in Birmingham. This was not unfounded. The motorsport record was real. The testing infrastructure was real. The reputation was built on something. And yet, and this only becomes visible looking back, the summit was already complicated. Even in 1925, a Times reporter covering a labour dispute at Fort Dunlop had noted that tyre imports had risen sharply in the first half of that year compared to the year before. The efficiency drives that triggered the dispute, changes to mixing mills designed to save time and reduce cost, were a management response to pressures that were already forming. Competition from abroad, cost pressures at home, the eternal industrial tension between what workers needed from a job and what accountants needed from a process. In 1925, 30 years before the peak, the forces that would eventually unravel the fort were not inventions of the 1970s or the 1980s. They were patterns as old as industrial capitalism itself. The relentless pressure of competition from cheaper alternatives, the difficulty of maintaining high wages and employment numbers in a market that would always find a lower price somewhere. The fort's management understood this in 1925. They understood it in 1954. Whether they understood quite how serious it would become is another question. In 1970, Dunlop withdrew from Formula 1 and Formula 2. The decision was described, in the motorsport press of the time, as startling, a word that captures how little it had been anticipated. For enthusiasts who had simply assumed Dunlop's presence at the top of motor racing as part of the natural order, it was a jarring moment, a signal that the company's relationship with ambition, with the kind of visibility that motorsport provided, was changing. Perhaps they believed it was a practical decision, a reallocation of resources. Motorsport was expensive and the returns commercially were uncertain. Looking back, it reads differently. It reads like a company beginning to contract, pulling in from the edges, retreating to what seemed secure, making decisions that seemed reasonable in the context of the moment, and would look, with the distance of years, like the first steps of a very long retreat. But in 1954, none of that was visible. The fort was enormous, and its name was on the sides of lorries from one end of Britain to the other, and 10,000 people walked through its gates every morning, and the machines ran on through the night. That was the summit, the highest point. They just didn't know it yet. Change, when it comes to a place like Fort Dunlop, doesn't arrive as a single event. It arrives the way weather arrives over flat ground, gradually, then all at once. First, a shift in the light, a cooling in the air, the kind of thing you notice but don't name, because naming it would require admitting something you're not yet ready to admit. And then, before you've quite finished reassuring yourself that it's nothing, the sky has changed completely. The tyre industry was changing before most people at the fort were prepared to see it. Some of it was technology. In the rubber mixing department, inner tube production had been a significant part of the fort's output for decades. As tubeless tyres became standard through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, eliminating the inner tube entirely, building the seal into the tyre and wheel rim. Entire departments found their purpose narrowing. The technology didn't vanish overnight, but the direction was clear, and the direction pointed away from what those departments were built to do. The shift to radial tyres was more fundamental still. The difference between a cross-ply tyre and a radial isn't obvious to someone who's never looked closely at a tyre's construction, but it matters enormously. Radial tyres last longer. They handle better at speed. They run cooler. Once the car manufacturers understood this, once the quality premium was established, the market moved. Michelin, the French manufacturer, had pioneered radial technology and was selling into the British market with a product that former Fort workers describe, in retrospect, as genuinely superior for the conditions of post-war motoring. The question of how to respond to radial technology was one that Dunlop's management wrestled with for years. Which direction to take? How much to invest? Where to build the new capability, if at all? These were not easy questions, and the answers that were chosen, or not chosen, would matter. As one former engineer remembered it later, the choices made about radial technology, and when and how to make them, were among the factors that shaped what happened next. It was framed, as such things always are, as a strategic decision. In retrospect, it looks more like a hesitation at a moment when hesitation was expensive. Meanwhile, from abroad, the pressure on price was already building. The same Times piece from 1925 that covered the Fort Dunlop labour dispute noted, almost in passing, that tyre imports had risen sharply. Imports. In 1925. The rhythm of that particular anxiety, British manufacturing facing competition from producers with lower costs, runs all the way through the 20th century like a thread you can pull from any point. It was there in 1925. It was there in 1965. It was there in 1975, by which point it had acquired a new intensity. The oil crisis had remade the economics of transport and manufacturing simultaneously. Inflation was eroding the value of everything wages bought, and the broader British industrial settlement that had held since the war was beginning, visibly and painfully, to fracture. Fort Dunlop was not insulated from any of this. But perhaps the most consequential force gathering in these years was corporate in nature. The question of who owned Dunlop and what they intended for it. In 1967, the company changed its name to Dunlop Limited. It was a rationalisation, a tidying up. But it came at a moment when the wider corporate landscape was shifting under the company's feet. Consolidation was the logic of the age. Companies joining together to become large enough to compete globally, to achieve the economies of scale that national markets alone no longer guaranteed. The Fort had been built on a national market, British cars needing British tyres. And that market, as Britain's relationship with international trade evolved, was no longer an island. In 1971, Dunlop and Pirelli merged. The Pirelli-Dunlop union was not presented as a retreat. It was presented as strength. Two European tyre makers, one British, one Italian, combining their resources, their technology, their manufacturing footprint to create something large enough to compete with the American giants. Goodyear, Firestone, the companies that had the scale of the American market behind them and were using it to push into Europe. The logic was sound. In 1971, the European tyre market was consolidating, costs were rising, and individual national champions faced the prospect of being progressively outcompeted by players with larger balance sheets. Perhaps they believed it was the only way forward. The merger lasted roughly a decade. By 1981, it was dissolved. The Science Museum Group's corporate history is plain about this. Dunlop and Pirelli separated, the alliance that had promised to create a stronger combined entity, having failed to deliver what both parties had hoped. The specific reasons for its failure involve the kind of detail that belongs in a business school case study, rather than a eulogy: cultural friction, strategic disagreements, the difficulty of integrating manufacturing operations across national boundaries and in multiple languages. What matters for this story is simpler. The alliance came, it went, and Dunlop emerged from it without the strength it had sought. The early 1980s brought the next decision: and this one was irreversible. In the early 1980s, Dunlop's European tyre operations were sold to Sumitomo Rubber Industries. Encyclopaedia Britannica dates this to 1982. The Science Museum Group's records indicate 1983. The precise year matters less than the fact. A British tyre company, built in Birmingham over 8 decades, sold the heart of its European business to a Japanese manufacturer. Not because anyone wished the fort ill. Not because anyone sat in a boardroom and decided that 10,000 Brummie workers were expendable. But because the logic of the balance sheet had arrived at a conclusion that the logic of industrial strategy, of place, of community, of what a works meant to a city, couldn't easily argue against. The European tyre business was worth something to Sumitomo that it no longer quite was to Dunlop. Someone made that calculation. Someone agreed to it. And the ownership of the enterprise on which those Erdington streets had been organised for 60 years changed hands in a transaction measured in assets and liabilities rather than in lives. In 1985, the remainder of Dunlop Holdings was acquired by BTR. BTR was a conglomerate, a company that owned a portfolio of industrial businesses and managed them with the logic of a portfolio manager rather than the logic of a manufacturer. This distinction matters, though it rarely feels like it, until it's too late to matter. A manufacturer asks, how do we make better tyres, faster, more efficiently, in ways that strengthen our position in the market? A portfolio manager asks, what does this asset return, and is that return sufficient given what else we could do with the capital? These are not the same question. They lead to different decisions. The fort, by the mid-1980s, had already seen most of its main production wind down. The great era of mass tyre manufacture at Erdington was, for practical purposes, over by the end of that decade. What remained was specialist production, and specifically the motorsport and motorcycle tyre facility that had been part of the fort's identity since its early racing connections. This was not nothing. The motorsport tyre business was technically demanding, reputationally significant, and staffed by workers with skills that had been developed over decades. It employed 241 people at the Birmingham site. Those people were doing something genuinely difficult, building tyres that went on vehicles competing at the highest levels of motorsport, under conditions where failure had consequences that reached far beyond a customer's inconvenience. But it was a fraction of what the fort had been. The building that had been built to store and distribute the output of a tyre empire, the central stores and offices structure that motorsports journalist had stood in front of in 1957 and reached for the word vast, was through much of the 1980s and 1990s quiet, used intermittently. Used, at one point, as support for an enormous advertising hoarding. A Ford Mondeo poster, visible for over a mile. One of Britain's great industrial structures, reduced to a billboard. The works hooter that had marked the rhythm of the surrounding streets for 70 years was no longer sounding. Not because anyone had made a single decision that it should stop, but because 1,000 decisions, each of them reasonable in its own terms, each of them made under pressure and in good faith, had brought it, step by step, to silence. Could they have seen it coming? Or was the collapse already written into the decisions that seemed so inevitable at the time? Perhaps they couldn't see. Perhaps the view from inside an institution that has existed for 80 years makes the institution seem permanent in a way that no institution actually is. Perhaps the Pirelli merger seemed, in 1971, like a reasonable response to a difficult situation and seemed, right up until the moment it fell apart, like it might yet work. Perhaps the Sumitomo sale seemed, in 1982 or 1983, like the best of the available options. Perhaps the BTR acquisition seemed, to those who couldn't prevent it, at least like continuity of some kind. Perhaps. These things are never simple, and the people who made these decisions were not monsters. They were people working with the information they had, under pressures that were real, in an industry that was genuinely difficult. The tragedy of industrial decline is rarely the story of obvious villainy. It's the story of decisions that seemed worth making, accumulating into an outcome that nobody, standing at the beginning of the chain, would have chosen. The machines in the mass production buildings had already stopped. The proving ground, the 800-foot banked section, the skid pad, the surfaces of granite sets and polished pebbles, had already been given over to other purposes. Where Dunlop's engineers had once tested tyres to the edge of failure in the service of understanding, shoppers would eventually park their cars. The ground that had existed so that tyres could be pushed to their limits now served to carry people toward retail outlets on a Saturday afternoon. The fort stood. The specialist facility worked on. And for a little while longer, Birmingham still made tyres. By the time February 2014 arrived, most people in Birmingham had long since stopped thinking of Fort Dunlop as a tyre factory. The central building had been a construction site, then a managed office park. Urban Splash, the regeneration company, had acquired it in 1999 and spent the following years converting the derelict warehouse into the vertical office park that stands there today. 7 floors of commercial space, a hotel extension, shops, and leisure facilities. It reopened in 2006. The architects at Shedcombe had to contend with the building's extraordinary depth, that 52-metre floor plate that admitted natural light only reluctantly at its edges. The result was something that preserved the fort's extraordinary exterior while reorganising its interior for an entirely different purpose. Marketing agencies moved in. Consultancies, the kinds of businesses that generate their value through ideas and relationships rather than through the transformation of raw materials into physical goods. The fort's shell had been saved. The question of what saved means when the purpose has gone is one the building cannot answer for itself. But down the road, in an Erdington facility that was part of the wider Fort Dunlop site, tyre manufacture continued. 241 people came to work each day and made tyres. Specialist tyres. Motorsport tyres for racing cars competing in major series. Motorcycle tyres. Tyres that were the end product of the same compound science, the same construction knowledge, the same vulcanization process under heat and pressure that had been the fort's core expertise for a century. The workers in that facility were among the last people in Britain doing what the fort had once employed 10,000 to do. In February 2014, Dunlop Motorsport Europe announced the closure of the Birmingham plant. 241 jobs at risk. Production to be transferred to existing continental facilities. Car tyre production to Hanau in Germany. Motorcycle tyre production to Mont-Lausson in France. The announcement was made. The processes began. Parliamentary debate touched on the context. The involvement of adjacent land in Jaguar Land Rover's Castle Bromwich expansion. The efforts to find an alternative Birmingham site. The particular geography of industrial decision-making in which a factory's fate can be altered by what the neighbours decide to do with their land. None of it changed the outcome. At the end of May 2014, tyre manufacture in Birmingham ended. It is worth sitting with that sentence for a moment. Tyre manufacture in Birmingham ended. Not paused, not relocated within the city, not restructured into something smaller that would carry on. Ended. The last tyre built in the city that had been making tyres since the first decade of the 20th century was built in May 2014 and sent to wherever it was going, and the machines that built it were shut down, and the workers who had operated them cleared their lockers and walked out. 241 people, not 10,000. 241, which is itself a measure of how much had already been lost before this final loss arrived. Former workers describe a particular calculation that many of them made in the years leading up to closures like this one. You knew, or suspected, that redundancy was coming. The question became, how long to hold on? Long enough to secure the redundancy payment. The sum negotiated through the union over years of collective bargaining. The financial cushion that was the practical difference between managing and not managing while you worked out what came next. Workers with families, mortgages, the ordinary obligations of a life built around a steady wage, made this calculation without drama or ceremony. They stayed as long as they could stand it. They took what they were owed. They left. There was nothing romantic about it. It was the decision of people doing what people do when institutions fail them. finding the least bad option and taking it with whatever dignity they could maintain. The machines that had run 3 shifts, that had run in some form or other on this site since the middle of the First World War, went quiet. The quiet that followed was different from ordinary silence. A works that has been producing for a century has a particular acoustic presence, not just the machinery itself, but the movement of people, the ventilation systems, the low-level hum of activity that becomes, over decades, simply the background noise of the surrounding streets. When that stops, what you notice first isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of a kind of silence that shouldn't be there, a silence in the wrong shape. People who have lived near works all their lives describe this. They notice the quiet before they've consciously registered that anything has changed. Something is different. Something is wrong. Then they understand what it is. The Fort Dunlop tyre plant was not the last works in Birmingham. The city is not a ruin. But it was the last tyre plant, and its closure was the end of a line that ran back to 1888 and a Belfast yard and a Scottish veterinary surgeon fitting air tubes to his son's tricycle wheels. That line had become, over the course of a century, something that employed 10,000 people at its peak, that shaped a city's north, that provided a particular kind of stability that once seemed as permanent as the brick buildings built to house it. And then it was gone. The building still stands. This is the thing about Fort Dunlop that makes it different from most industrial ruins. It wasn't demolished. It wasn't left to crumble under rain and time. It was, in the language of regeneration, saved. Urban Splash spent £45 million converting it, filled it with tenants, gave it a hotel and a car park, and the kind of amenities that attract businesses looking for character alongside connectivity. By those measures, the project was a success. The Fort Dunlop building has been, unambiguously, preserved. And if you drive past it on the M6 today, it still looks like what it was built to look like. Something enormous, something deliberate, something that was built to be seen from a distance and to communicate, without any words, that what happened here mattered. The long red brick elevation, the tower, the scale that makes the surrounding infrastructure of motorway and retail park look provisional by comparison. But walk inside, and the distance between what was and what is becomes difficult to quite absorb. The atrium is clean, the floors are clean, the lighting is the considered even light of a managed office environment. There are coffee shops. There are the kinds of meeting rooms that have glass walls and whiteboards, and the particular slight anxiety of places where people present things to other people in the hope of impressing them. The businesses that operate here work in the service economy, in ideas, in communications, in digital products, in the management of processes that happens somewhere else. They are good businesses. Their employees are doing genuine work. None of this is anyone's fault. But the carbon black is gone from the air. The smell of curing rubber has been gone for decades. The compressed air hiss, the snap and crackle of the mill, the rhythm of the vulcanizing press. These are not things that can be preserved in an office atrium alongside the artisan coffee and the visitor parking. A little further along Fort Parkway, on the ground where the proving grounds banked sections once stretched, where the skid pad occupied its 400-foot rectangle, where surfaces of polished pebble and granite set were laid specifically so that tyres could be understood rather than assumed. There is a retail park. The Fort Shopping Park. Restaurants. Clothing stores. The ordinary commerce of a Saturday afternoon. You don't need to say anything about this. The geography says it for you. And yet, because these things are never entirely simple, there is something else worth noting. At 40 Fort Parkway, Erdington, Birmingham, Dunlop Aircraft Tyres Limited is registered and operating. An active company, incorporated in 1996. It designs, manufactures and retreads aircraft tyres for major aircraft makers. It is a real company doing real manufacturing on real ground adjacent to where the fort once stood. The making has not entirely gone. It has narrowed, specialised, redirected itself into a corner of the original enterprise. A corner that requires the same basic expertise, the same rubber knowledge, the same application of engineering to the demands of vehicles that need to decelerate reliably from high speed. but a corner nonetheless. This is not a happy ending. It is not meant as a happy ending. It is simply the full picture. Decline is rarely total erasure. It is a thinning, a narrowing, a redirection of what work means on the same patch of ground. The fort's industrial inheritance survives in diminished and changed form, as it survives in changed form almost everywhere that it once existed. The difference is the building. The building still stands, still dominates the motorway view, still carries its name above the entrance, Fort Dunlop, as if the name itself were a form of memory, keeping something present that the activity inside can no longer quite justify. What remains of the proving ground is tarmac and shopping. What remains of the mill is an open-plan office. What remains of the vulcanizing room, where heat and pressure and chemistry turned raw rubber into something that could carry a racing car at racing speed, is a meeting room perhaps, or storage, or one of the quiet corners that every large building has. The corners that don't quite fit any commercial brief and exist between purposes, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. What remains of Fort Dunlop is the fort. Stand beside the M6 on a quiet morning before the traffic has built to its daytime weight, and look at it. Look at the length of that elevation. Look at the tower. Look at the deliberateness of it. The sheer plain declaration that this is a building that was built to matter, built to last, built at a scale that said, "We are serious about what happens here." It is still enormous. It is still legible from the motorway as something that was once at the centre of something larger than itself. The red brick hasn't faded to insignificance. The proportions haven't shrunk. The building is exactly what it was built to be. And what it was built to be was the visible face of an industrial enterprise that, at its peak, employed 10,000 people, drew its raw materials from the other end of the world, tested its products to the limit on ground that is now a shopping park, and put its name on the tyres of racing cars that competed at the highest level of world motorsport. All of that is still in the building, if you know how to look for it. What isn't in the building is the work. Not the work of mixing rubber and carbon black in the mill, of building tyre carcasses by hand with the precision of a craftsman who has done this 10,000 times. Of watching the vulcanizing press close and waiting out the heat and pressure that transforms raw material into something that matters. Not the work of 10,000 people moving through gatehouses every morning in their shifts. The early shift, the late shift, the night shift that kept the site running through the dark hours because there was always more to produce and the machines didn't need to sleep. Not the typing pools or the canteen vans or the laundry that cleaned the work clothing saturated with carbon black. Not the laboratory testing or the proving ground methodology or the particular expertise of knowing, by touch and look and smell, whether a compound had been mixed correctly and whether a tyre had cured properly. Not the Friday wage packet, not the camaraderie of the floor, not the multi-generational employment that meant a young man starting at the fort in 1968 might find himself working alongside the son of someone his father had known on the same department. Not the sense, ordinary, unexamined, completely taken for granted until it was gone, that this place would still be here next year and the year after that, and for however long it took to see out a working life and retire on a pension that reflected 40 years of showing up. None of that is in the building now. The building is clean and managed and full of people doing their work. The hotel is comfortable, the coffee is good. None of this is a reproach to anyone who works there or manages there or chose to locate their business there. They are doing what people do when a place becomes available and the terms are right. But there is a particular kind of grief, not dramatic, not violent, not the grief of sudden loss, but the grief of the long, slow recognition that belongs to places like this. The grief of understanding fully what used to be here, of being able to see the shape of the thing that's gone in the shape of the thing that remains. The building was built at a scale commensurate with an industrial purpose. That industrial purpose is gone. The building remains. In Birmingham's north, the streets that house the workers are still there. Erdington is still a place where people live, where children go to school, where the ordinary texture of a neighbourhood continues. Communities are not only their industries, and they continue after their industries have gone, changed and diminished and adapted and still stubbornly present. But something was lost here that cannot be precisely named because it wasn't precisely one thing. It was the combination of purpose and place and belonging and craft and community and the knowledge that what you made with your hands mattered, that it would be driven on roads and raced on circuits and would carry the weight of the world's ordinary movement. And that your work, however unglamorous, was part of what kept Britain moving. That is what went when the Tyre plant closed in May 2014. That is what had been going in increments since the ownership structures shifted in the early 1980s, and the portfolio logic began to replace the manufacturing logic, and the decisions began to be made somewhere else, in a language that had no word for what the work meant to the people doing it. The building stands. Beside the M6, as it has always stood, its long brick face presented to the motorway traffic that barely slows to notice it. Still enormous. Still legible as something that once mattered. Still carrying, in the persistence of its red brick mass, the memory of everything that happened here. The rubber and the carbon black and the heat and the noise and the 10,000 lives that turned up at those gatehouses, shift after shift, for most of a century. What remains is the building, and the silence inside it, where the work used to be.